Well, welcome to the Teens in Tech seminar. Would like to share with you a few words of introduction. First, it is no surprise that what is going on in our culture and what's going on in our world, and especially in our specific location in Silicon Valley, is something that's happening that has never happened in the history of humanity. If you take a look at the adoption of various technologies, if you take a look at the adoption of various devices, etc., everything on every single scale is exponentially getting bigger and bigger, and the level of adoption is just getting bigger and bigger. If you feel in some ways that technology or whatever this thing is has kind of come in, set up shop, and overwhelmed you and our culture, you are correct. If you take a long look at history as to the other developments of technology, there is nothing like this in the history of history. If you take a look at some people and how they've been studying this. If you take a look at specifically on the telephone circuit, you can see the incredible rise of not only the landlines, but now mobile phones and then smartphones. And those numbers are just increasing. So the percentage of households adopting these technologies is just absolutely increasing. And then if you pay attention to the news or follow any blogs and those different types of things, you will start to see all sorts of crazy things happening in our world. The most recent thing that I've kind of geeked up on is Amazon Prime Air. Has anybody seen that in the news? Where drones are going to now deliver your packages in 30 minutes or less from the warehouse, kind of a deal. So picture, flying drones all over the place delivering Amazon packages and stuff like that. The other thing that I've been following, which is fascinating, is how technology has influenced the biomedical industry. And if many of you might know about 3D printing, and not only 3D printing of materials, but now 3D printing of biological parts, so noses and ears and parts that you can graft on to your skeleton and things like that. Being able to print those on a 3D printer and stuff like that. So things are just insane. We live in a very amazing world. So I've been really fascinated with this for a long time. I want to share with you a little bit about my background so you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. I recognize that on a subject like this, where the presenter is coming from greatly influences what it is that they share and the biases that they have. So I share this not so much to give you my resume, but it's important in this area because there's so many different opinions and thoughts regarding what technology is doing to us and especially to our kids. I just want to share with you my heart and the background from where I'm coming from. I play a couple roles. I'm the spiritual life director here at the King's Academy, which has all sorts of different responsibilities, including counseling kids, setting up programs, including chapels, and I work with a phenomenal team that helps to put together programs and events, and we do a lot of one-on-one relationships with kids. I'm also a pastor, and I've been a pastor for over 20 years at various churches, working with both families and youth and children, as well as general congregations in that particular capacity. And then the third thing that I bring to the table is for the last 13 years, I've been teaching at a college a course on contemporary culture as well as worship and biblical theology and trying to figure out how those two fit in. And if you teach or study on that subject, you will start to realize that technology is right at the forefront of culture and of theology and how all that plays together. So tonight, what I'd like to share with you is some of my reflections regarding all of those experiences that I bring to the table. And again, I share that just to be transparent with you. I want to share with you some of the insights that I've gained, some of the stuff that I've been reading. And we're going to be a little bit on the, shall we say, educational end of things. In the topic of adolescence and technology, social media, as well as safety and security and all those kinds of subjects, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of anxiety. Again, I asked some of you, how are you feeling about tonight? There's a lot of trepidation that goes on. And what I'd like to do is actually take a little bit of a different bent. If you're interested in hearing more about some of the things that are actually happening, there's other seminars that I can point you to. So I don't want to duplicate what it is that they've shared. Tonight, what I want to do is I want to educate us. I want to move through a way of thinking about technology and a way of thinking about our families and a way of thinking about humanity that can help us understand a little bit better about what's going on. And once we understand what's going on, just the mere fact that we're attempting to try to understand it will actually do great damage to the negative parts of what technology can do to us. And what I mean by that is the more we learn and understand, the more we can inoculate ourselves from the effects that technology can have on us. So that's a little bit of what I want to do tonight. So I'm going to bring in some of what I teach in the college and some of what I've been thinking about regarding technology. I want to answer basically 4 main questions tonight. I want to answer the question or address the question, what is technology? Because I actually think we need a good definition of what technology is. It's not just social media, it's not just the cell phones, it's much bigger than that. What is technology actually doing to us? How are we going to respond? And I'm going to give you some really practical tips for families and for parents for how to respond. So that's the lay of the land of where we're heading. So first, what is technology? Well, if you're going to ask this question, why not go to Wikipedia? So, the word technology refers to the making, modification, usage and knowledge of tools, machines, techniques, crafts, systems, and methods of organization in order to solve a problem, improve a pre-existing solution to a problem, achieve a goal, handle an applied input-output relation, or perform a specific function. Now, that's a huge definition. What I'd like to point out for you is this. The technology isn't just the device. It's not just the tool. It's not just the machine. It's actually systems, methods of organization, tools that are not just physical things that we hold. You're sitting in a technology. You are wearing a technology. You are handling in your hands right now, with the paper, a technology. Everything that we have in our world that is in some way, some sort of physical manifestation of organizing techniques, craft systems, is a technology. Now, that's really important to understand. Technology is not something that just emerged upon the scene recently with the boom of, Silicon Valley or what we call high tech or electricity. Technology has actually been around for a very, very long time, since the very beginning of humanity. I've heard it once been said that actually the way some people like to define technology is anything that was invented after I was born. So a lot of people think of it in that way. But technology actually has been around for a long time and is much bigger than just the simple devices. So what is technology? Well, for example, a cooking pot, bow and arrow, Galileo's telescope. The device in the middle is called an Antikythera mechanism. It was found in Greece. They believe it was invented somewhere around the 1st or 2nd century BC in Greece, and it keeps time. And what scholars tell us is that if this thing were still working to this day, it would be accurate to milliseconds of the same chronology that we keep today. Talk about the steam engine, oil lamps, you've got the phonograph, and of course another ancient technology, the cassette tape. But there's other technologies too. Roads, the way in which we build our houses, money, clothes, the Constitution, grades, and even language. When you start to study technology, you start to realize that all of these things are encapsulated in what technology theorists call technology. It's something that we use to organize. It's a system of thinking. It's a way of putting ideas together. So I don't know if you've ever thought of the Constitution as a technology, a way of organizing us. I don't know if you've ever thought of grades as a technology, a systematized way of organization. If you ask the question, what is technology? Technology theorists will say, fundamentally, they are extensions of our humanity. Extensions of our humanity. Here are some examples of what they mean. What are binoculars? Except extensions of your eyes. Your eyes have limitations, but we invent a technology that extends the capacity of our seeing out into this world and amplifies it greatly. What is a hammer except an extension of our arm or our fist? What is a wheel? And the cars that you drove in to get here today except an extension of your legs. Are you tracking so far? Are you hanging? Are you okay? I know this is very academic. What is the internet or electricity except an extension of your nervous system and the way in which your brain and consciousness and thinking and processing? What are clothes except an extension of your skin? Some people have suggested that the cooking pot is actually an extension of your stomach. And then my favorite, what is a lazy boy an extension of? I'll let you draw your own conclusions there. So if that's the case, if all of those things are an extension of us, what I would like to suggest to you is that all of these things are also extensions of some part of who we are. And what I mean by that is simply this. The computer is an extension even of our eyes, our consciousness, the way that we process. The memory chips that you have in your computer is an extension of our memory capacity. The keyboard is an extension of your fingertips. There's all sorts of different ways of thinking about this. And again, this is why they're called technology theorists, because you can think about these in different ways. What is social media? Except an extension of our desire to want to connect with one another. And so all of these things are really extensions of us. Now, this is really important to understand. I would suggest to you, for us, if we're going to ask the question, what is technology, we need to first recognize that it's an extension of us, which then means this. Technology is also a reflection of us. That what we think about technology, how we process what technology is actually a thought process about who we are. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have social connections? What does it mean to have consciousness? What does it mean to have attachment from one human being to another? I like to put it this way, that the distinction between us and that is very, very thin. Much thinner than most of us probably realize or think. Are you okay? I see a lot of blank stares, so it makes me nervous. The reason why I think this is important is this. When I hear and talk to families and students and parents about technology and social media and some of the things that are going on, when I hear the seminars that are happening, what I hear frequently, and it's not a bad thing that I hear this, but what I hear frequently is a blaming of the device, or a blaming of the social media, or a blaming of the technology. And we kind of point to that and say, that's a problem, or that's the thing that's getting in the way, or that's the thing that's disrupting my life, kind of a deal. But what I would like to suggest to you is if technology theorists are right, and if you accept their thesis, if technology is an extension of us, therefore it's a reflection of who we are, if we simply blame the technology or the device or whatever it is, then we may be missing the real issue as to what's really going on as human beings. And I see this fairly frequently, that the phone is the problem, or the social media is the problem. And what I'd like for us to do is to think about this a little bit differently. Maybe those things are not the problem. And if they are the problem, or if they're a part of the problem, maybe we need to reflect a little bit more about here and what's going on here, and why has that become such a problem. The other side of this is if we love the technology, we may actually be really loving ourselves. Now, don't raise your hand, but how many of you have stood in line for the newest iPhone at the Apple Store, which boggles my mind? Or how many of you, when the next newest device came out, said, I have to have that? Or how many of you have ever said, what did we ever do before X? We've become so dependent, and for some of us, it's a very amorous relationship with our devices. If we love the technology, then there's a very real possibility that we're actually following into self-love. And that's a danger on that side as well. Two dangers. One, we outsource or we scapegoat whatever complexities or challenges that we have, and we blame the technology, and I don't think that's a proper solution. Two, if we love the technology, then I'm afraid that we may be falling more and more into self-love and narcissism. That's the general thesis that I'm working with. That's the general concept and idea that I've been mulling over for a long period of time. Many of you know the story of Narcissus, who falls in love with his image, and ultimately that is his demise. What's not commonly taught about Narcissus is simply this. The chief error of Narcissus was not that he fell in love with himself, but rather that he failed to recognize that it was himself in the fountain's image. And I wonder if our culture, and including myself and all of us, we're failing to recognize that it is really us in the image of the technology, that it's reflecting back to us. So, that's my suggested thesis on what is technology, that it's an extension of who we are. It's actually much more close to who we are than we realize. And maybe the reason why we have this kind of love-hate relationship with the technology is because we actually have a lot of love-hate relationship with our own selves. We have our own inner turmoils, don't we? About what we like and what we don't like about who we are. And that's simply reflected sometimes in how we relate to the technology. Okay, so number two. If that is technology, if that is what it is, number two, what is it doing to us? And a lot of us immediately jump to bad things. I'd like to suggest that there are some bad things that are happening, but we can't couch it first in a bad thing. We have to first understand what it is. The main person who writes about this is Marshall McLuhan. Anybody heard of this guy, Marshall McLuhan? He was far ahead of his time. He actually predicted Amazon.com in the 1960s. A pretty incredible intellect. He got a couple things wrong, but pretty much a lot of what he talked about has actually come to pass when you start to read some of his materials. His famous quote is, "The medium is the message." Summed up also, we shape our tools and then our tools shape us. And what does he mean by that? He means simply this, as best as I can understand it. When you pick up your phone and you have an interaction with somebody else with your phone, the interaction that you're having with that person through your device is a fundamentally different kind of an interaction than if we were having a face-to-face interaction. Excuse me. In other words, the medium that you use to communicate is actually doing something to that communication more so than what it is that you're saying. In fact, you could be texting somebody, or you're in the bedroom, your kids are in the bedroom, and you're texting to each other, kind of a deal. And according to McLuhan's thesis, that kind of conversation is actually a very, very different kind of conversation than if you were to have a face-to-face conversation. And what he's simply suggesting, too, is this. It's not only a different conversation, it's actually doing something to us. And doing something to us very subtly, subconsciously, unconsciously, that we don't even realize is happening to us. What's important about this thesis is technology is changing us, transforming what it is to even be human, regardless of content. Now, this is huge, because when I talk to friends and families about the internet, I often hear the internet is bad because of its content, because of what it is that you're seeing or what it is that you can have access to through the internet. What I'm concerned that we're missing is it's not just the content, it's the fact that we're on a screen. It's the fact that we're typing with our fingers. It's the fact that we're accessing information through a device that is rewiring our brains and changing how we think and how we process in ways that we don't even understand. In other words, it's not what you do on your phones, it's that you are on your phones. So when you carry the device around, when you engage in the technology, it's doing something to you, regardless of the content. Now, we're going to get to content, and I've given you a handout that will help us understand what content is really out there, because obviously, with the dawning of the internet age, we have access to all sorts of wonderful content and extremely nefarious, debaucherous, damaging, destructive content. Again, the approach that I'm coming at it with for tonight is simply this. Maybe the fact that we're actually on the device, regardless of what it is that we're looking at or what links we're clicking on, is actually doing something to us. So it's not what you do on your phones, it's that you are on your phones. The solution is therefore, and this is what we're going to get to tonight, is how you are to live with your phones. Okay? It's not what you do, it's that you're doing it on your phones or your device or your computer or the internet. And the solution, therefore, is how. And this is simply illustrated by this question. Have you ever had the vague sense that your cell phone is calling you? How many, be honest? Where your phone is down or it's on your hip, it hasn't buzzed, it hasn't rung, but it's sitting there, yearning, begging, pleading with you, touch me, rub your thumbs all over me. I've got something great for you. And that simple shift, I would suggest, is an illustration of what's happening. And that's just one example. This goes on and on and on and on. Neil Postman, in his fairly famous book now, Amusing Ourselves to Death, talks about the television age. Beginning in the 14th century, and he's quoting Lewis Mumford in his book, Technics and Civilization, beginning in the 14th century, the clock made us into timekeepers and then time savers and now time servers. How many of you would agree fully with this sentence? The introduction of the technology of the clock, regardless of the fact that it was keeping time, radically changed and shifted how you and I behave in this world. And some technology theorists would even suggest that much of what capitalism has become actually would have never been possible had it not been for the clock. Now, time, the sun, the moon, the stars, the earth hasn't changed. It was the introduction of that technology into our awareness that radically changed how we think about time. And I think if we're honest, I know I feel this. I mean, I read that sentence and I go, oh, that's totally how I feel. I feel like I'm a servant of this. That clock runs my life. I mean, I've been in churches my whole life, and I've been at King's Academy for 3 years now, and I will tell you something. I hate the bell. Because I'm having this wonderful conversation, and all of a sudden that bell, and I have to serve that time. The technology of the bell is nothing but evil. Okay. Now, we're going to get a little bit academic. There's an ancient story told by Socrates. And the ancient story is told about a god, an Egyptian god named Thoth. And he invents a brand new technology. He invents the technology of writing. And he thinks this is going to be a fantastic thing. Listen to how Socrates talks about this invention. And let's see if this resonates. It's going to be a little academic. We'll try to bring it home. Here is an accomplishment, my lord, the king, which will improve both the wisdom and the memory of the Egyptians. I have discovered a sure receipt for memory and wisdom. Some of you are laughing already. Thoth, my paragon of inventors, the discoverer of an art, is not the best judge of the good or harm which will accrue to those who practice it. So it is in this. You who are the father of writing have out of fondness for your offspring attributed to it quite the opposite of its real function. Now, in that statement alone, back, this has got to be 6th century BC, is the understanding that those who invent the technology do not even understand what the technology is going to do to us. There's a blindness to it because you're so engrossed in what it is that you have produced, you're blind to what it is actually doing to us. Those who acquire it will cease to exercise their memory and become forgetful. They will rely on writing to bring things to their remembrance by external signs instead of by their own internal resources. What you have discovered is a receipt for recollection, not for memory. And as for wisdom, your pupils will have the reputation for it without the reality. They will receive a quantity of information without proper instruction, and in consequence be thought very knowledgeable when they are, for the most part, actually quite ignorant. And because they are filled with the conceit of wisdom instead of real wisdom, they will be a burden to society. Now, this was over 2,600 years ago that this was written. Question, according to Socrates' thesis, the explanation of what's going on, that writing is actually not going to enhance memory, it's actually going to do damage to memory, was he correct? How many of you feel like your brain is just absent all the time and you can't even remember the most simplest of things? And we've inherited a written and now technological culture. Whereas if you read even to biblical times, and this is fascinating to me kind of as somebody who likes to study the Bible too and biblical history, when we think about oral culture and the ability of ancient people to memorize massive amounts of information, we have no concept for that. In fact, we have high levels of skepticism. No way they could memorize that. But if you study the technology and you think about it in this way, it's actually very possible. In fact, it's mostly validated that ancient peoples had a phenomenal memory. And with the introduction of writing, in an effort to aid memory, it has actually done damage to our memory. Why? Because we've extended it to the piece of paper, to the language, and now we don't need to use it anymore in the same particular way. Does that make sense? So stuff is going on with us that we don't even realize. So, what is high tech or the technology that's happening today? What is that doing to us? What are the end results of the technology that we are now growing up in and now inheriting? Real quick disclaimer. I recognize that I'm going to give you 4 points that are mostly on the negative end of the spectrum. There are effects that are happening with our technology that are actually doing great things to us. So I don't want you to walk away with thinking that I'm simply saying that the things that are happening to us are only negative, because there are some amazing, phenomenal, positive benefits to society and to us that are happening. I simply point out these 4 negative things because I think they get to the core and the crux of some of the anxiety and the worry that we have in our families and with our kids, okay? So just want to make sure that I say that very clearly. Don't walk out of here thinking that I'm a complete Luddite and, anti-technology. Clearly, I'm not. So anyway, there's the disclaimer. 4 things. Number 1, modern psychologists and technological theorists are suggesting that the technology, including our computers, our devices, the screens, the internet, are disrupting our development. They are disintegrating our relationships. They are distracting our mental skills and abilities, and they're depriving us of feeling. Disrupting our development, disintegrating our relationships, distracting our mental skills and abilities, and depriving us of feeling. Now, even with that list alone, I can imagine that if you think about your kids, and maybe even think about yourself, you might automatically already be able to relate a little bit to this. So first, disrupting our development. I have a bibliography in the handout that I'm going to give you, so these books will be listed there, so you don't have to write these down. Let me share with you a quote from Catherine Steiner Adair's book, which was just recently published. I'm going to recommend this one to you. Research suggests that the process of tapping on a screen or keypad and engaging with the screen activity may itself be rerouting brain development in ways that eliminate development of essential other neural connections. Your child needs to develop reading, writing, and higher-level thinking later. Research suggests that the process of So what I wanted to highlight for you is this simple statement. Notice in this statement, she's not talking about what you're tapping on. She's talking about that you're tapping on a screen. It could possibly eliminate all of the other neural connections that your child needs for reading, writing, and higher-level thinking. The very process of interacting with pixels and electricity and tapping with your fingers is actually rewiring the brain development. And this gets even more nefarious and more concerning the younger and younger you go. And what's fascinating is as I've been preparing for tonight and doing a lot of this reading and studying and thinking about it, it's amazing to me how much I'm starting to see iPads and phones become more and more popular for younger and younger kids. And as I'm reading this stuff, I'm just wondering what it is that's going to do to them and to us as a society as a whole. In their brain, the whole brain child, in their book, The Whole Brain Child, these doctors say this: neuroimaging suggests that when kids play violent video games, the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that allows us to balance our emotions, be empathetic, and make thoughtful decisions, becomes less active. And at the same time, the amygdala, the part of the brain that causes us to act before we think, be territorial and reactive, becomes more active. Keep in mind that repeated activation in the brain impacts how the brain is wired. The brain develops what it gets practice doing. And there it is again. The fact that we are interacting and participating in these things is wiring our brains. So the fundamental lesson or point in that it's disrupting our development is I would ask that you really seriously consider and think about children in the most, and especially if you used child psychology and the things that are developing very early on in life, the more and more you put them in front of these technologies, the more and more the kinds of development that are needed for human interaction, reading, writing, deep thinking, processing skills may actually be compromised the more and more they interact with these technologies. And that includes television, that includes iPads, that includes internet, all of these different types of things. One more quote. The content matters not just in terms of what kids' eyes and minds are exposed to, but in terms of how the circuitry of their brains get activated and wired. So in other words, a nice way of saying it, just because they can doesn't mean that they should. And it's really amazing how these, especially with Apple products and the cult that goes along with Apple, how they've developed it specifically to be as simple as possible. And if you think about that for a moment, that you're interacting with a technology that doesn't require you to be as intellectually engaged, that in and of itself is fairly telling. Now, I'm not making any strong critiques over Apple products, clearly. What I'm simply suggesting is, what is it doing to us that is how things have been designed and how we've adopted them? And it's amazing. Many of you know this. Put an iPad in front of a 3-year-old and they know how to use it instantaneously. So, number one, I'm suggesting, and these other authors are going to suggest, that the technology that we're using, developing, employing, interacting with, and especially at younger ages, is disrupting our development. It's actually changing the neuroimaging in our brains. It's changing the wiring in our systems. Number two, it's disintegrating our relationships. Many of you know this. I've talked to many people who are communication theorists or who have majored in communication. You know that prior to any technology, we had communication face-to-face, and if you've taken any elementary, entry-level college classes regarding communication, they will say something along the effects of 7% of what you communicate is actually words, 93, 95%, whatever it is all the other stuff that comes along with communication, gesture, tone, all those different types of things, interaction, personal relationship, and stuff like that. Again, what is happening to the relationship when you introduce a technology? As soon as another technology comes into play, certain things get hidden away from that personal interaction relationship. And this is things that people have been talking about for a long time. What we're simply suggesting is the same kind of thing that happened with the telephone, which removed a certain level of that communication. Whatever that 93 to 95% of communication is, some of that is now being removed from the equation. Think about what's happening now with texting and cell phones and internet and email. The same kind of effect of removing that kind of interactive, interpersonal relationship connection is now having the same effect on us when it comes to texting. And what's fascinating, there's so much you could do a whole entire study on just texting alone. Some students have reported that, as soon as they get started in texting at the very middle teen years, they start to say things like, I prefer texting because having an actual conversation is actually very difficult, and I don't know how to do it. Why? Well, again, the technology is doing something to us. Again, hear this. It's not just that they're texting certain words or that they're using certain language, and that's an issue that you will need to attend to. It's just simply the fact that the medium of communication is texting. They could be writing wonderful Shakespeare on their, which would be quite a feat anyway. They could be writing wonderful content, but it's the fact that they're using the medium of texting that would change how interpersonal relationships happen. Back to Steiner Adair's book. The development of empathy comes from direct experience that lays down neural pathways in both the left and right hemispheres of the brain and through the body. To say we feel empathy for someone is biologically accurate. When those neurons fire, they dissolve the border between you and others, and that is empathy. In other words, the more and more we connect with each other, the stronger and stronger our empathetic connection with you grows. And the more and more you remove that connection, the more and more you put something between you and I, the less and less our empathy grows. And the less and less our empathy grows for one another, the ability to feel for one another, the more we feel lonely, the more we feel alone. Dr. Howard Gardner and his assistant Katie Davis wrote this: "It may feel more comfortable to remove the risk from social interactions." In other words, that's exactly what texting does, right? It removes the risk. Kids say this all the time. It's easier to text than it is to have a face-to-face conversation. It removes the risk. But if we don't put ourselves out there, we can't truly connect with others. And this was what leads to isolation. And if we don't truly connect with others, we can't put ourselves in their shoes, which is empathy. Okay, so what about this? If I tried to sum up this particular section, technology ultimately numbs that which it extends. In other words, if I'm trying to connect with somebody, but I put in between us a medium, phone, internet, email, those kinds of things, it's not only going to remove portions of communication that should be there, it's also going to numb the parts of me that are supposed to be connecting with that person. So the very effect of the difficult, challenging, hard work it takes to look somebody in the eye and to feel what they feel is slowly getting numbed. And if that's happening, if social media is extending our interpersonal interaction, then our ability to connect is also, I think, when I hear about loneliness and when I hear about people feeling alone and isolated, and when I hear about growing levels of depression and anxiety and those different types of things, my mind, because of the study that I'm doing, is going almost immediately to the technology. Is that having a greater effect on our psyches and our interactions and our relationships than we even realize? What's fascinating, too, is that in states of loneliness and isolation, we often go directly to these very devices in order to get healing for that. And it may be, again, just like any addiction, a very vicious cycle. The remedy is to ensure that face-to-face always takes place. Always. This is the way great empathy and great relationships happen. Face-to-face. And it's hard. And we're going to see a little bit more of that. So number one, we're disrupting our development. Number two, we're disintegrating our relationships. Number three, are you okay? Sorry. Number three, we're distracting our mental skills and abilities. I want to give you a little test. I realize that I'm a really good-looking guy, but the reality is that moving pixels win every single time. Compared to what's happening on the screen right now, I'm extremely boring. You don't want to look at me. In fact, have you ever had a conversation with somebody in a restaurant or in a bar or in a public place, and you're having this conversation, but you can tell that they're actually attending to the screen, the flickering pixel that's happening behind you? And what that is suggesting to you is this, that the very medium, I could talk to you all day about cats chasing lasers. Boring. What you want to see, what your brain is automatically drawn to is the flickering pixel on the screen. When you accept the reality that moving pixels, electronic things, always trump face-to-face, you start to realize that your ability, your mental capability to attend and to focus and to think deeply about things is starting to become compromised. That's the basic fundamental thesis. In his excellent book, Nicholas Carr, in his book, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Nicholas Carr says this: When we go online, we enter an environment that promotes cursory reading, hurried and distracted thinking, and superficial learning. It's possible to think deeply while surfing the net, just as it's possible to think shallowly while reading a book. But, and here's the key point, that's not the type of thinking that technology encourages and rewards. When you read a book on your iPad or online or on a screen, the very fact that you're on that, your brain subconsciously knows that with one tap, you're in a completely different world. Whereas if you read a concrete book, you are forced in some ways by the technology of the written page to think deeply and to focus and to follow through whatever that author's line of thinking and thesis is. That's the general thesis, that the fact that you're reading it on an iPad or on the internet, your brain knows subconsciously that you are immediately drawn into another world just by a click of the button. And so the very medium, the very technology doesn't encourage and doesn't reward deep thinking. How many of you suggest that you're really, really good at multitasking? Or have heard your kids say, I'm really good at doing 5 things at once? So I'm hopefully going to dispel that. Well, I'm not me, but Clifford Nass from Stanford University is hopefully going to dispel that. Let's check out this video.
Stanford University.
Thanks for coming in.
Back in 2010, we decided to study what would happen when kids were chronically multitasking, using email while on Facebook, while trying to do their homework, while listening to music, texting, etc., etc. Would it change the way their brains work when they weren't multitasking? The very powerful and surprising result of that 2010 study was high multitaskers, kids who multitask all the time, even when they were asked not to multitask, when they were only doing one thing, showed less ability to filter out irrelevancy, much more difficulties managing their working memory, and ironically, even the ability to multitask. We then decided to look at a different domain, namely emotional development. We focused on 8 to 12-year-old girls because that is the most important age for social development in girls. So we created a study, a survey of 3,400 girls, and looked at how much they use media. We also asked about multitasking. And then we asked a bunch of questions about their social and emotional development. How likely were they to succumb to peer pressure? How good did they feel about themselves? How much they slept? How many kids their parents thought were bad influences? And the results were incredibly upsetting. Kids who are heavy media users, heavy multitaskers, showed much worse social and emotional development. So what's happening is kids are not practicing basic emotional skills.
It was really cool last year, and I'm really happy.
There seems to be a pretty powerful curative, a pretty powerful inoculant to this, and that is face-to-face communication.
But yeah, I think it was a really good day.
As your kid grows up, that old-fashioned saying of, look at me when I speak to you, should come back. Yes, it was annoying for me as a kid. Yes, it is annoying. But it's annoying for an important reason. It's hard work. But it's a hard work that leads to incredibly positive outcomes.
Ned Hallowell says it this way: stimulation has replaced connection, and I think that's what you need to watch out for. I think that clip by Clifford Nass is just really brilliant, something for us to seriously consider. Disrupting our development, disintegrating our relationships, distracting our mental skills and abilities. We don't multitask, and in fact, we are worse off when we do. And then the last thing, which is perhaps one of the most challenging, is it's depriving us of feeling. And this goes back to the empathy. Sherry Turkle has been working at MIT for a long time. And she's been working specifically in her book, Alone Together. She talks about human interactions with robots. Now, you think this is kind of fun and silly. And then, of course, interactions with robots that look like this. And they're trying to figure out how to create robots that cause people to have emotional connection. So Furbies and Aibos, those are all there to help kids and to help the elderly have some comfort, have some friendship, have some relationship. And what they are finding is that you're actually having very similar emotional connections to robots that you would have with a normal, regular human being. And if that's kind of freaky, One of the highest, one of the most popular games in Japan is called Love Plus. Love Plus is a video game that was developed for you to create your own avatar girlfriend. As you create this girlfriend, you program her to be essentially whatever personality or desire that you want her to be. And the program has been set up that she will actually text you and call you and interact with you through your mobile device. This is the top-selling Nintendo game in Japan. Now, what's fascinating about this is when the device gets an upgrade and they have to do an update and the old has been replaced with the new, psychologists have noted that the people who have been really pulled into these devices actually experience feelings of grief and loss, that they've lost their girlfriend to the update. So these are things that are telling us something radically insightful and challenging for us as human beings. What is that that's going on? Now, ultimately, this quote, I think, really sums up what we need to take away from these studies. As we saw with simpler robots, the children's attachments speak not simply to what the robots offer, but to what many children are missing. And this is what it is that she found. Many children in this study seem to lack what they need most, parents who attend to them and a sense of being important. And this, I think, illustrates once again the idea or the concept that the technology has extended out to the thing, our emotions, a portion of who we are, and as it's extended out into whatever this thing, this technology is, it's changing us. And so children imagine sociable machines as substitutes for the people missing in their lives. When the machines fail, it is sometimes a moment to revisit past losses. What we ask of robots show us what we need. Back to Steiner Adair's book. When those neurons fire, they dissolve the border between you and others, and that's empathy. That's, again, the quote that I mentioned earlier. One more video from Dr. Michael Thompson, who explains a little bit of this same concept again.
The number one area of questions these days is how do I control my child's interaction with the digital world? What do we do about all these gadgets? Is she doing her homework? Is she on Facebook? I can't see. She sits in the corner, so I can't walk around her. It's very, very hard to limit our children's involvement with the digital world, and it's partly hard because we're addicted ourselves. Kids see us doing this. They believe this is where their lives are going to be lived, and they are drawn to it. Parents are having the hardest time teaching their kids to turn it off, to go to bed, to not take cell phone calls at dinner. And that's because dad may be taking cell phone calls at dinner, or mom might be taking cell phone calls at dinner. I have a 10-month-old granddaughter, and she's fascinated by her mother's iPad. And she's clearly going to be a digital child. What she has to experience is a lot of love and connection and looking into people's eyes, because we know that the capacity for empathy and the capacity for attachment requires that you get into a relationship with someone and where the mirror neurons in both of your brains are reacting to each other, imitating each other, focusing on each other, and ultimately, of course, loving each other. That's what makes them good, right? And I'm pretty sure screens can't do that.
So part of the uncomfortable portion of this seminar, and part of the uncomfortable portion of studying anything about childhood development and adolescent development, is oftentimes what we see that's happening in our kids is often a reflection of us. And so, I'd like for us to consider that. Again, not with condemnation, not with guilt and shame, with understanding. What are we doing? What's happening to us? How have these devices changed us? And how shall we respond? So these are the four things. They're disrupting our development, disintegrating our relationships, distracting our mental skills and abilities, depriving us of healing. Okay, really quickly, how shall we respond? I've got several things that I'd like to share with you. And I have a parent, one of my staff members, who's going to share a little bit of how she responded to all of this. recognize that we are, for the very first time in history, experiencing something that we've never experienced before, what I'm calling a generational inversion. How many of you have had to ask your child to help you with the technology? This has never happened before in history. Prior to this, older generations always had what younger generations needed. And because of the advancement of technology and because of those little rises and advancements that are happening so rapidly, for the very first time in history, younger generations have what older generations need. And some of the ways to put that is natives versus immigrants. I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase before, that digital natives are kids that are now being born in the late 90s and early 2000s. They're natives. This is their native environment, where people who perhaps were born earlier are called, in some ways, immigrants to this culture. You're now traveling into a foreign land. So it's a way of helping to think about this. One of the things that I tell my students at the college is this phrase: avoid generational chauvinism. It's so easy in this day and age to think that because younger generations have whatever technology they have or have the savvy that they are, quote, better. It's also easy for older generations to think that because they have history and tradition and knowledge and wisdom and all that kind of stuff, that they are better. And what I try to encourage my students is, if you take either one of those positions, then neither generation can benefit from the other. There are gifts that both generations give to each other. So my encouragement is to avoid generational chauvinism, which can be interpreted in this particular way. If you think your kids have amazing advancements because they get the technology and you don't think of them any higher than you are just simply because they have that. Avoid that kind of generational chauvinism, which can often lead to some insecurities that I know that some parents have regarding this. Like, I don't know anything about social media. I don't know how to get online. My grandmother said log on, which meant put another piece of wood on the fire kind of a deal. So I don't know anything about this. You do not have to think less of yourself or think that you have no influence in the life of your child just simply because of that. So that's another way of interpreting it. Just avoid generational chauvinism. It's really important for all of us to learn from one another. I think younger generations have something that I need. I really believe that. I've been working with kids my entire life. And it's not just because I want to be a perpetual adolescent, although there may be some psychosis there as well. But it's because I recognize that they have something I need and I want. But I also want to teach them that I have something that they need and that they want as well, which has been demonstrated in some of the videos that we've seen. So ultimately, how shall we respond? Love. I'm a follower of Jesus. I don't have time to go into all of the theology and the development of Jesus and the biblical story as to how this matches up with technology. That can be saved for another time. But as you think about what's going on, love, the idea of self-sacrifice, of laying down your life for another person, applies, in my opinion, more to this life, or just as much to this world and this technology as ever before. Same level of application: to truly love, to love yourself, to love your children, to love one another, to lay down your comforts, the things that you have. So I think love is always at the top. As I mentioned before, do not fear. Do not be afraid. This has happened before, all the way back at the time of Socrates with writing, to the development of the steam engine, to Gutenberg's press. Technology has always been advancing humanity. It's always been there. So do not fear. What's happening now has been happening throughout all of history. And don't blame. Don't blame the technology. If it really is us, we have to think more deeply about what's going on in this world than just simply outsourcing our blame to the technology. Don't be seduced by it either. Recognize that if you are falling passionately in love with your devices and your technology, or you find yourself all of a sudden needing it, recognize that you may be being seduced by it. Seek first to understand. Oftentimes in our reactive kind of posture, we have a tendency to condemn and judge first. My suggestion is first understand what's going on. I was always afraid whenever I give seminars that some parents are going to go home and immediately rip everything out of the sockets and put up a wood-burning stove and we're going to go back to the good old days. But first understand what's going on before you make any moves. And then lastly, embrace your calling as a parent. You're here, and I always try to say this whenever I speak to parents, God bless you. You have my utmost honor and respect and support. You're here because you want to learn, you want to be a better parent, you want to figure out tools or whatever it is. Embrace your calling. You have been given a tremendous commission, and I believe very strongly that you can be extremely successful in this world, even in the midst of the complexities of the technology. So some practical tips, we'll scream through these really quickly. First, talk about tech with your kids. If you noticed throughout the entire presentation, and even through the videos, face-to-face conversation is absolutely essential for all of these things that we're concerned about or worried about. But here's the thing, don't talk about tech. Talk about each other. This would be my suggestion. If you just simply talk about the device, you may be missing a very core part of the conversation that you need to be having. Because the technology, again, is just an extension of us. So let's talk about us. What's going on here? When I hear, and I've read, parents get really concerned about what their kids are putting up on Ask.fm or Facebook. And their immediate response is to say, okay, why are you on Facebook and we're going to get rid of Facebook? My question is, what's going on in the child that causes them to want to put those kinds of things concerning up online? So when you talk about tech with your kids, don't talk about tech, talk about them. Recognize online activity realities. I've given you some of that in your handout that I'll point out later. And start with the art of questions. Seek first to understand. Ask your child, ask each other, ask your spouse, what's going on? Let's try to understand. How do you feel? What are you feeling? Have I ever offended you? Ask a lot of questions. And then talk about your faith being reflected in everything. Talk about what your faith journey and how that can be reflected in this technology. One of the art of the asking of questions I just thought was so brilliant here. Catherine Steiner Adair talks about the corrective parent versus the connective parent. The corrective parent, when there's a loss of focus or a child's doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, a corrective parent will say, "Are you on Facebook? Shouldn't you be doing your homework?" The connective parent would say, "You were going to write that paper before the weekend so you'd have a good weekend. Are you going to stand by that decision you made? Or are you following through on the commitment you made to yourself to do your homework?" Very, very different way of phrasing the question that I thought was very helpful. Number 2, consider carefully how you use technology. And we talked about this. You heard it from the videos. Everything communicates something. You model for your kids, and you are their number one influence. How you act and how you behave in the home with this technology is making a difference. Again, this is going to be one of the books that I'm recommending, but at the very beginning of the portion of this book is testimony after testimony after testimony of kids younger than high school and junior high, but kids who are saying, "I just wish my father or my mother would put down their phone and have a conversation with me." There's a story in there about a mother who thinks that just by having the phone off to the side, her toddler is not noticing because it's off to the side. And she notices that every time she picks up her phone, the toddler stops and just stares at her. That even at that age, the kids are noticing how you act and how you behave. Kids, everything that you do communicates something. Shut it down, turn it off, put it away. And I'll give you an example of how to do that. Unplug your gadgets and devices. Do not underestimate the power of abstinence. And abstinence is not just the complete avoidance, it's the discipline to not be mastered by the temptation. That's what abstinence is. Your technology is not as important as your kids. Hopefully that doesn't need any further explanation. It is the parental paradox of our time. Never before has there been so much opportunities for families to plug in and at the same time disconnect. And I love this quote here. Tech offers nothing your baby needs more than you. Absolutely nothing. Here's one that I think is really, really helpful because this goes, by the way, to work and all sorts of other relationships that you have. Be very mindful for how you speak about your friends, your child's friends. When you condemn or when you say things about your children's friends, about, "Oh, you heard that they got busted because of this or they put this online," if your communication to your child about your friend, about their friend, is condemnatory, I guarantee you, your child will think, "My parent is not safe to talk to because what if I did that? Would my parent be a safe person?" You instinctively know this. If you have somebody in your life, or let's say a boss who in front of you speaks badly about another coworker of you, you pick up intuitively, I don't know if I can say things to that person because of how they speak to somebody else. So this isn't just about adolescent development. This is about human interaction. Be very, very careful for how you speak about your child's friends. If you want to speak about your child's friend, I would recommend the same love, the same patience, the same understanding that you would have for your child's friends as you would have for your child. Have an amnesty policy. Does your kid know that home is safe? Look, the technology is there, the social media is there are predators out there, all those different types of things. Does your kid know that you are the first place that you can go to and it's absolutely safe? An amnesty policy simply says, I don't care what you've done, come home. This is a safe place. We'll take care of it later. This is a safe place. Be the first responders to your kids. She writes this, just as with a paramedic or an ER team, the first moves you make and the quality of your response have a critical effect on outcomes. If you find your child all of a sudden in a compromising situation regarding technology, having a first response philosophy or idea regarding it can save an amazing world of hurt. So thinking about how you first make your move, how you react and how you respond to maybe even some very negative things that you come up with can have a huge difference. And again, all of this goes back into the previous videos and the things that we were talking about. You're developing empathy and relationship and attachment with your child through how you respond to these things. One of the things that has been around for a long time that we'll recommend, of course, sign a family tech covenant. I've put one in your handout for you as an example. You don't have to use it, but there is one there for you as an example. To establish family boundaries. For example, no devices behind closed doors, put the computer in public. That's something that many parents have done that has been very successful. In other words, there simply are no devices in the child's room. It's always in public in the family room, and that can be a very simple thing. Write a family mission statement. This is something that I picked up from Patrick Lencioni's book, The 3 Big Questions for a Frantic Family. And I won't read the quotes there for you, but it's something that has been very helpful. Most companies have a mission statement. Every school has a mission statement. Every nonprofit organization. This is who we are and this is what we're about. Very few families do that. And what Patrick Lencioni has done is taken those kinds of ideas and concepts and applied them to the family. Describe what your family is and who you're going to be together. What makes our family unique, what is the most important priority in our lives, and how are we going to keep these things alive. So writing a covenant together and establishing who we are as, like doing a mission statement together can also be very helpful. I know I'm throwing a ton out here. You don't have to do all of these tonight. And then one of the things that's important, take advantage of the little, the small, the seemingly insignificant moments. Man, I cannot overstate this enough. Small investments over long periods of time always reap great rewards. Small investments over long periods of time, reap great rewards. Don't ever underestimate that moment, and it could be 30 seconds, 60 seconds, where you put down your phone and you have a face-to-face conversation or whatever kind of a deal. Those things make a huge difference. Skin trumps silicon every single time. Every time. Now, I know that kind of contradicts because I threw out the cat there and all of you were like, woo, kitty cat, laser. But when it comes to development, when it comes to attachment, when it comes to human relationships, skin trumps silicon every time. And this is exactly why, this goes back to the theology that I like to bring into this. This is exactly what God did in Jesus. We believe so desperately that God became flesh. By the way, God used technology all throughout. You ever think about Noah's Ark as a technology, or the basket that Moses was put in as a technology, or the mud bricks as a technology, or the sling that David used to slay Goliath as a technology? All those are technologies. And I love what he does in Jesus. The word, the technology, becomes flesh. So that same idea, same concept is there. Okay, I'm going to ask Julie to come on up. I've given you a ton of suggestions. Julie has a wonderful story, a brief testimony to share with us. This is my staff member, Julie JD. She takes care of all the service stuff here, and she's going to share with you what she has done.
Good evening, everybody. So a little disclaimer before I even share my story. I really come tonight as a parent. I feel like I don't have all the answers. In fact, I feel like I'm just beginning my journey in understanding this, and I am really sitting here with you trying to absorb this information too. And in fact, when he asked me to share, I thought, what can I share? But I think he really wanted me to just share my own story with my own kids, because it probably is something you can relate to, at least some of you in the room, and just an encouragement that we're all in this together trying to figure out how to parent our kids. And I know all of us really want to do the right thing when it comes to technology, but it's really a big question, and it's changed so much even in the last 10 years. So my story personally, I have 4 kids. I have an 18-year-old girl, Emma, who just went to college this year, and she's coming back in 10 days. I'm excited to see her. I have a 16-year-old son, Ian, who's a junior here, and then I have a 13-year-old son, Nicholas, who's in 8th grade, and my youngest is Anna, who's 12 in 7th grade. So I had 4 kids in 6 years, and to be honest, those first 6 years were a very busy time, and the technology question at that point was very simple. It was Blue's Clues, on so I could make dinner and just get through the day. And, I definitely have never been a big fan of TV. In fact, that's a part of my story and my testimony. I'm not a TV fan at all. But in those early years, TV I just had to have to get through the day at points and to just to do the things I needed to do with 4 young children. But when they hit the school age years, I was blessed to be able to homeschool. And one of the things I loved to do with them was just turn that TV off and read books to them. And I think a little bit of these pictures of, pulling out the technology and putting in the wood-burning stove, I think that's kind of actually what I would love to do if I could, and that's kind of how I lived. I was a little bit like Little House on the Prairie. I mean, I really did actually have all 4 kids sitting with me on my sofa with the fire going, and those were great, great years. In fact, I'd love to go back to them. But we read a lot. We read a lot of the classics. We turned the TV off completely, and by the time they entered King's, I actually had disconnected cable, did not have TV at all, and in my mind, we were going to have as little technology as possible in our house. But lo and behold, my kids started turning into teenagers, and that's pretty hard to not have technology around when you have teenagers. And my first real struggle and wrestling with the technology subject came when my son was in 7th grade, Ian, and he had been really struggling and getting to know kids here at the school. He was shy and quiet, and he's one of these kids that would pick up a math book and read it for fun, and didn't have a lot of connections with the kids here. And one day, he had a heart-to-heart talk with me, and this is in 7th grade, literally in tears, saying, "Mom, if I could just get this video game, then I could talk to the other kids at school, because they're all playing this game, and I don't know anything about it. I don't even know how to enter their conversations because I don't have this game." And that's when the mom heart kind of went, okay, there's a lot of things we don't have in our house. We're kind of on the real conservative side when it comes to technology, but I want my son to be able to connect. And I knew he had a point that, that was one of the main topics for these kids at school, was the video games they were playing. And it was a pretty simple one, Minecraft, which probably a lot of you are aware of. And in terms of video games out there, it's a pretty safe one. So, you know what? I gave in, whatever you want to say, and we got Minecraft, and that kind of started our journey of, allowing video games into the house, and pretty soon my kids had iPhones and were texting and Facebook, and, and so I entered this world, constantly going, trying to evaluate step by step, and yet it seemed to keep going faster than I could keep up, to be honest. Before I knew it, once you give a kid an iPhone, all of a sudden they're doing all these different things with apps that I didn't even know existed, and they teach me things constantly. But one of the things that really was a thread for me in trying to make decisions about what technology to let in, it really did come down to their connections with their friends. And obviously there's the elements of, is it clean, is it safe, is it not violent, those kind of things too. But in the end, I found that the video games, especially for my boys, much more so for my boys than my girls, but my boys, the video games was a connection point with their friends. And to this day, my boys are in band, and the band kids play a game together. There's a game that my son plays with friends from youth group. They don't go to the same school, but they will play online with each other, and that's how the boys connect. And, I struggle as a parent, in my ideal little house on the prairie world, I would love to have them all over to bake cookies and let's go, ride horses or something. But the reality is that in this world that we live in today, that is actually one of the most common ways, especially boys, connect. I'm not saying that's necessarily right, but it is reality. And so that was a door for my children to grow in friendships. And so I've had to look at that, and I'm not saying I'm completely there yet, and I have all the answers, not at all. One thing that we do, as Kevin was suggesting, we do dialogue a fair amount about it. All of us on our own have done different things for Lent. We, as a family, celebrate Lent, and I know my daughter has done no Facebook during Lent. I've done no emails after 9 p.m. for Lent. My son could not quite do the no video games for Lent, but he's getting there. He's getting closer. But, we use those kind of opportunities throughout the year as this just another check-in, like how much are we on our devices, Recently, I've gotten, actually, I would say in the last month, ever since Kevin told me I was going to be speaking, I thought, I'm going to talk to them even more than normal. So we have been making sure our Sunday family meals are always phone-free, which it was actually harder than I expected this past month because we've all gotten to a point that we've had a phone nearby, and including me. And I think that's something that I've been wrestling with as well. I realize that I'm a model for my kids, and when I come home from work and I sit there and I get back on my computer and I keep checking my phone, they're looking at me and they're seeing that that's how I connect with my world. So I'm making a more conscious effort to slow down in that as well. So that's just some of my story, and again, no answers, but hopefully you can relate to some of that, and I think we can pray for our kids together as we try to figure out the right way to respond to technology.
Thank you. What I so appreciated about Julie's story is both sides of the puzzle. It's the avoidance of it, but then it's an understanding that it can be a benefit. But what was fundamental is the relationships and the connection and the thinking about it, the reasons behind all that stuff. I'm going to take some questions from you guys in just a few moments. I just want to point out to you a little bit, the handout that I've given to you, I recognize that what I've done tonight is a little bit of like fire hydrant time, and there's so much more. And so I apologize for screaming through a ton of material and some of it very academic. I feel like it's important for us to understand. So that's, again, part of the direction that I come from. I've given you some amazing resources that you can pursue this additionally. Some of the websites, a lot of this stuff is absolutely free as well. So you can check out some videos that are additional online regarding what's going on. Download some free handouts and sign up specifically at Digital Kids Initiative, which is a project by the Center for Parent and Youth Understanding. And Walt Mueller does a great job keeping up on all the technology and the social media and the apps and all those kinds of things. He keeps up on that, and he can even give you an email on a regular basis about what's going on, some alerts that are happening. Lots of stuff to read. And then the only other things that I wanted to point out that I gave you in the handout in page 9, on page 9 and page 10, is an example of a covenant of conduct. And again, you don't have to do it exactly this way, but it may be a helpful guide for you to start out saying, okay, what are the guidelines that we're going to have in our family, and how are we going to think about this? The one that's on page 9 is from the Digital Kids Initiative from the Center for Parent Youth Understanding. And on the back of that on page 10, I've given you a suggestion that you don't just use the I language and have your kids sign it, but you use the we language and we sign it. So that's just a suggestion for you to go in that direction. Page 11 is, of course, a ton of reading and some books if you're interested. I brought some of my copies here if you want to flip through them, if you're interested in some of that. And then on page 12 and 13, that comes from Lawrence Steinberg's book, The 10 Basic Principles of Good Parenting, that I've been recommending for a long time. Very, very simple. I've put it in an outline form that you can cut, put on your refrigerator or your nightstand, and just remind yourself of some of the fundamental principles regarding parenting. Okay, you guys have hung in for a long time. It's 8:22. Are there any questions really burdening, and then we'll let you go at 8:25. Okay, sir. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We're trying to record this. So,
so first of all, thank you very much for your very informative discussion. I wanted to ask quickly about, in your interactions with teens, how do you deal with when the computer usage becomes an addiction around, like, for instance, using online gaming, getting in the way of social relationships with the family, and also homework and other activities? And what are some suggestions you have about that?
I have an article that I didn't put in this. My friend who's studying this right now said to me as I was preparing for this, computer addiction is no different from any other addiction. What they're finding out is the same chemical processes that are happening regarding chemical addiction is the same processes that are happening in computer and technological addiction. So whatever same employment strategies that you would use for narcotics or things like that, or alcohol, or any of those regular addictions would be the same kind of things that you would employ. So with alcohol, it's Alcoholics Anonymous, and there's also counseling and those different types of things. There are similar things that happen with technology as well, and sometimes going cold turkey might be not a bad idea. Okay, I saw some hands. Oh my goodness, some hands back here. Yeah. Is there somebody that can, Ben, can you come to be a runner for me with the microphone?
I just wanted to know if some of the material that you had, I was trying to write it down as quickly as I could. Probably just should have been doing screenshots with my phone, but
that's awesome.
But there were some great ideas that you had there. Is this available?
Excellent question. Yes, we have a videographer here. The video will be made available. The presentation will be made fully available, and
Great.
This outline will be made available. We're going to put all of that on the web. It's free and public. It's our public service to all of you.
Great. Thank you very much.
And then Ben's going to run the microphone for me. I saw one more hand back there, and then a hand over here.
Excellent presentation. I guess my number one concern is this concept of trying to raise children that are able to decide for themselves, and where things we want to limit then become even more interesting and more exciting, and so there's this constant inconsistent challenge of saying, we're not going to monitor you, but make sure you're doing your work. But I'm not quite sure that system is working, where we get more and more strict, that stuff, the shows and the online social aspects, becomes even more tasty, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, sure.
So as a parent, it's a very tough stage, especially with a 13-year-old girl, to try to say, okay, we're not going to be like strict, but there's good here and there's bad, and and we want to still be approachable. I think I'm an approachable dad, but I feel like there's a lot of trial and error, and how do we navigate those waters?
So a couple of thoughts come to mind. Number one, I don't actually mind. In fact, I love parents that are strict. If your children are not exemplifying kind of the maturity of awareness and being able to own their own journey, then parents, again, this is embrace your calling as a parent kind of a deal. The inductive kind of approach of questions and answers, questioning your child as to what's going on to see if they can become aware of that, is another approach. We mentioned the prefrontal cortex. That's this part of your brain that determines what's right, what's wrong, what's socially appropriate, what's socially not appropriate, consequences, long-term thinking. All that is being developed. It's not just being developed biologically, it's actually being developed relationally. So the more and more you have conversations about consequences and actions, that part of the brain is actually in development with those conversations. The last thing that comes to mind, I hope this is helpful, is don't just set behavioral boundaries, set maturity boundaries. In other words, when you can exemplify to me a level of maturity that reaches these kinds of ways of thinking about your behavior, then I'll go ahead and let loose and let free and be a little bit more loose. I've used a cone analogy for a long time that has been helpful for some parents. The cone analogy starts very, very narrow. The amount of privileges that you have, however young, and it's very different from every family, is very, very tight. You don't let your toddler, walk to school by themselves, kind of a deal. So the restrictions are very tight when they're young. And as they grow older, you slowly loosen those restrictions. How you loosen those restrictions is contingent upon the things that we talked about. How much development in the prefrontal cortex do you see? Sorry, it's not like you're checking out on your prefrontal cortex every single day, but how much of the cognitive abilities are you noticing, and what kind of maturity boundaries are being honored and being respected? My friend who's actually doing this work in child psychology right now was telling me that her 16-year-old daughter has gotten rid of all of her technology. She hates it. She recognizes that she's lonely. She recognizes that she doesn't feel good about herself. Every time she goes on Facebook, she actually feels worse about herself. And so she, on her own, 16, has said no. So when she has exemplified that level of maturity, my friend has gone like this. Okay, well then you can have a phone. I mean, I'm watching you become more mature in that kind of a deal. So this lady had her hand up. Ben, can you run? This is Ben Davis, my newest hire, everybody.
Thank you. I love the 10 Commandments for parents and students, but the students one only has 7, and I really don't want to make up the last 3. So can you give them to us?
Sorry, I don't know what to do about that. The 10 Commandments are there from Lawrence Steinberg. The 7 are ones that I wrote. Yeah, they are adapted from Lawrence Steinberg's book because the reason why I did that is because I believe that students grow in their maturity if they have been given very, very high standards. And I want them to recognize that they actually can influence their children. I tell kids, listen, you want to influence your mom and dad? Clean your room. Do the dishes on your own without asking. You will watch your parents go crazy and go, what just happened to my child? So I try to encourage them. You actually have influence with your parents, and that's not to say that you have authority, but to say you have influence. How you act and behave can actually change your life. Imagine that. So that's why I've written them. So they don't come from Lawrence Steinberg. It's just my adaptation of the 10 Commandments from the parents tried to be applied to the kids. Okay, I need to shut it down just because I want to be honorable to your time. And thank you guys so much for coming.